I always knew I had been rescued. I was born in Greensboro, North Carolina, and lived in an orphanage for 2 months. But then I was adopted and taken to a small town in western North Carolina where your furniture used to be made, and raised by a loving couple with another sister in a wonderful home in Valdez, North Carolina. Now, if you've ever been there, which most of you have probably never heard of it, it's a town about the size of Unionville, with one street, a couple of stores, 2 stoplights. But in the middle of the town is a huge Romanesque church, the Presbyterian church. And that was my church. Now, in the 60s growing up, Valdez didn't have a McDonald's. It didn't have a movie theater. It didn't have a mall. So all we had to do was go to school and go to church. And so church was my life. Youth choir, youth bells, Sunday school, outdoor drama. At Christmas time, you can do that in North Carolina. I even did something most of us have probably forgotten about, the catechism. I had to be bribed for that one. But I did it all because that was my life. My father wanted to be a pastor, but he got caught up in the family textile business and wasn't able to do that. So he became the #1 volunteer, and my mother one of the first women elders. You know, it's said that when the church doors are open, people are there. Well, we were there at least 30 minutes early. And that's why I'm always early to everything. The church was my home, as was my family. And the church was made up of a lot of families that were kin to me, because the church was founded by a group of Italian Protestants. Yeah, you heard that right, Italian Protestants, who came from the northern part of Italy after receiving religious liberty finally in the 1800s for being Protestants. They began to immigrate, and they immigrated to the U.S. and to South America. And the biggest colony was in North Carolina, mainly because they were given free land. So my church was ethnic but Presbyterian. It was a very active church. It was large for that day, it was about 600 people, and had plenty to do, very basic faith. And I was taught from the very beginning that there was an all-powerful God who was in control of everything. But he was a very loving God, and he sent us his son to show us this love. But the verse that came to embody my life was what I found not only through the words spoken and the music sung, but from the scriptures, from the Gospel of Romans, from Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 8. No, it's not those verses, the most famous, but this is my story, my verse. We know that all things work for good for those who love the Lord and are called according to his purpose. That was my story. My feeling of being rescued came true. I found out the reason I felt that way my entire life in 1993 when I decided to look for my birth parents. This was before the days of the internet. You had to hire someone to do this. And I found my birth mother and a half-sister. And I was able to meet them. In talking to my half-sister, she shared with me what her life was like. Because the birth mother had many bouts of mental illness and many hospitalizations, she was in a home, her aunt's home, and then back with her mother, in an orphanage, then a children's home, back and forth, a very tumultuous childhood, so much that she waited extra long to have children because she wasn't sure she knew how to be a mother. She looked at me that afternoon and said to me, "Ann, you are the lucky one." But I knew it wasn't luck. It was God's providence, who had pulled me from one life into another. All things had worked for good in my life, and that's my story. And over and over and over in my life again has it been proven true. A big state university with 40,000 kids after high school? No, thank you. That was not for me. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but a high school of 80 kids, a town of 3,000, I wasn't prepared for anything like that. I wanted to go to a small school where the professors would know my name, where I would get to know a small group of people intimately. But if you want to know the real truth, I wanted to go where Daddy went. Because Daddy took me to school, to see his school, to see the quad, to see the well, and I grew up wanting to go to Davidson College, north of Charlotte, North Carolina. A small school of that time, about 1,200 students. But there was just one big problem. It was a boys' school. But once again, Providence. All things worked for good for me because the fall of 1973 was the year they decided to go co-ed. And on a fluke, a pipe dream, your reach school, I applied. I already had the room at the big college university waiting for me in that dormitory. My SATs were so-so, and I knew from Daddy that it was a hard school. I'll never forget the day when my mother came to the school, my high school, and got my principal out of the school to come get me out of geometry class to show me the letter that I had been accepted into the first class of women, along with 84 other women, to join 1,200 men in the school of my dreams. Now, I have to say to you high school seniors and juniors, wanting to go where your daddy went, maybe that's not the best reason to pick a school, but it was the right one for me. So I went to school, and the wonderful series of events began to happen there. The best one was I met a boy. Oh yeah, he dated the girl down the hall for a while, but that didn't work out. So he came to see me, and not only was he bright and cute, but he could play the guitar. And he spoke Spanish because he grew up moving all over the world and had lived in Argentina. So we started dating, and before long, those 4 years, we were called Ward and June Cleaver. For some of you younger people, I would say Mike and Carol Brady. We were together. We dated all through college, but my mother loved him especially because she said, "Oh, I've always wanted someone in my family to be a minister." And David wanted to be a minister. So I began to think about life as a pastor's wife and being part of a community that I had grown up in, the church, and serving God in some way, supporting Him. Again, Providence came to be. All things worked for good because the minute we got married in August of '77, we left for Scotland, a scholarship to the University of Edinburgh Divinity School, where I was free to study anything I wanted. And David took his theology. So I began to dabble in those kind of things. But the best thing was when I went to St. Giles Cathedral in the middle of Edinburgh, sat down with the ushers in their tails, and there was a Southern woman from the U.S. preaching. A woman could be a pastor and a preacher? I had never even considered it before, never seen it or heard of it. Well, it opened doors and led me to study more than theology, to take the requirements, and to go for ordination. The next year we came back to the U.S. to finish up at Princeton University, Princeton Seminary. The best part of that year was going to Long Island, and I have a very soft spot in my heart for Long Island. The church up there that we worked in was pastored by a pastor and his wife, and we lived with them. And they modeled for us a life of ministry blended with family life. I loved working with the youth there. They used to laugh at my accent, and I laughed at theirs. But they were kind and gentle and loving and affirming, just like the group of people that I had grown up with. And so it led me down the path to more than I ever dreamed, to ordination. I had the sense that the church was where I was raised, and a life in the church was where I was meant to be. but we almost missed Westchester. In 1984, we were serving 2 small churches in eastern North Carolina where the tobacco used to be raised. And by the way, I have cropped tobacco, and it is not fun. It's harder than any ministry job. But we went there for 4 years, had a daughter. Our daughter Heather was born there. Wonderful 2 churches, 12 miles apart, a lot of driving, a lot of meetings, but salt of the earth people with basic theology. But they affirmed these 25-year-olds. But after 4 years, suddenly, David came into the kitchen one day and said, I need to go back to school to become a pastoral counselor. Well, for those of you that don't understand that term, you might think that means a counselor for pastors. But pastors are the last people to go for therapy. You know it's true. But he wanted to go back to school somewhere and learn how to do therapy from a Christian standpoint, to allow you to talk about your psychology needs, your family life, but bring in elements of faith. 2 institutions rose to the top very quickly. One was way out in the Midwest, big city, big school, long history, great program, very challenging. And it looked like the best. It looked like you'd be the sure thing, the smart thing to do for a career in that line. He came back from that interview, though, a little bit nervous. Their standards were pretty high. His hands were kind of like this. But okay. He came back from Philadelphia, which was the other school, just getting off the ground, kind of satellite program in many suburbs and in the city. Came back from there waving a Phillies pennant and bringing soft pretzels. But still, we felt the big city was where we were supposed to be. It was the best training. It was obvious. So we began packing, told our churches we were leaving, began packing to move to the Midwest. When suddenly, Providence entered my life yet again. In the way it usually does, through my stomach. Right in my gut, there's this feeling, the Spirit must hit me in the gut. And it said to me, go to Pennsylvania. So we called up the Midwest and said, this is not where we're supposed to be. And we moved to Pennsylvania. Labor Day, 1984. We pulled into town with a 2-year-old with a southern accent and a dog, trying to find a place to live, while David was serving in different centers in this area and getting his training. I'm so glad we listened to Providence that day because it set us up with a wonderful 34 years in this area. It allowed me to become part of 4 wonderful churches and pastoring all 4 in different ways and meeting church families that were strong but yet hurting and needy, who loved me and I loved them back, who brought me up and educated me. Well, hopefully I gave them some words of knowledge as well. That Providence was entering in there too because some of these churches were temporary. I remember back in 2006, I was just finishing up an interim at Unionville Church right down the road, and there was nothing on the horizon. And David's income, as you know, counselors don't make that much money, especially if they're not psychologists. So we were getting a little nervous that nothing was coming open. But I kept saying, wait a minute, all things work for good for those who love the Lord. Something will appear. And in November, Doe Run Church called. Once again, Providence had called me to where I should be, and our whole family, and placed us in ministry together. But boy, we almost missed Pennsylvania. What a close call that was. In 2017, my gut called me again. Providence spoke to me again very loudly right in here and said, Ann, your family needs you now. So I thought, okay, it's time to retire. 38 years, that's enough. And I thought, oh, I'm excited. My daughter's getting remarried. I can be part of that. My son had married a wonderful girl. They were expecting a baby in November. And I thought, yay, I will stay home and take care of this grandchild. God knew I needed to be home because the baby was stillborn. And 2018 was a year of pain, anger, hurt, confusion, questioning for all parts of my family. And I was there, had the energy and the time to devote to them, ministry to myself, my husband, and to them. God knew what he was doing. But we also needed support as we were giving out as parents and grandparents. And so we looked for a home again, a church. The church was our home. And as Steve has found out, I'm sure many times before, you are not allowed to go back to the churches you've served. So I was not allowed to go back to any of my former churches, and we began doing what you did one day, called church shopping. We went to a few churches, but on March, I think it was probably about 18th, right around my birthday, we came here. And we saw people we'd known from other times in our lives, people I had worked with, people I went to the gym with who sang in the choir. And it was suddenly, the door was open. This was the church family for our next period of ministry. We had come home in a strange way because my husband's first counseling office was right upstairs. This is no accident. The lawyer who helped us adopt our son in 1986, his office was right next door. And we have pictures of us going to the courthouse for his adoption in front of the church doors. Back to Minor and Darlington we came. James began his first kindergarten class downstairs in your bucket school because the elementary school was under renovation. We met the staff and we thought, oh, they are feeding us what we needed emotionally and spiritually at this critical time in our life. I'd known Steve for years and thought he was just a great guy, very mission-oriented, very caring, very sweet, very wonderful. So I was thrilled to see him here. And we were thrilled to meet Greg. David loved that he spoke Spanish. It was great. They had that in common. But here's the one thing. Not only is he a great guy, he was very affirming to us, gave us good sermons, but I found out that my college roommate was one of his professors. Yes, I'm that old. But it was clinched when we sat in the pew and read the bulletin and realized that Caroline Cupp was Caroline Levy, a graduate of Davidson College, class 2005. But all of you have welcomed us. Even this week at Bible school, some of you came up to me to welcome me, which very much meant a lot during that year. You fed us. You gave us what we need. The choir, the leadership of the choir, the bell choir, people I've met in the hallways. You've given me what I needed. All things have worked for good for me. I love the Lord, thanks to you. And plus you had contemporary worship starting, which David and I both just adore. Friends, I'm here because my life centers on one verse. All things work for good for those who love the Lord and are called according to his purpose. That's my story. And I wonder, I bet, if you go home this afternoon and look back on your life, of all the pieces of the puzzle that have come together to see God's hand at work, providence will be your story as well. Let us pray.